All right, so now we're going to discuss Mahmood's piece, but I also want us to kind of zoom out again and think about some of the main goals that I have for this unit in our course. So we've already talked about the concept of agency. I'll be talking about that concept a bit more when we discuss Mahmood. But we're also going to be thinking about the tension between anthropology and feminist theory in this unit. So that's something we can also talk about Thursday. I mean, one thing to think about um, from the article by Holly Wardlow is, of course, the ways in which feminist thinkers study and go about understanding, say, sex work versus the way anthropologists do it. Of course, in many times there are many similarities, but again, it's important to note that anthropologists are interested in looking at the specific cultural contexts in which um, any of these lived experiences occur. And that may differ from a feminist theory, which is trying to zoom out of any one specific cultural context to make a kind of broader universal claim. And as we've already discussed, the imitations of agency, but we're going to continue to do that when we discuss the work by Saba Mahmood. So Saba Mahmood sadly passed away a few years ago, and she was is one of the most of excuse me, was one of the most important feminist anthropologists working. And she was a professor at UC Berkeley and worked in the Middle East. That was her area of expertise. So Saba Mahmood, again, I'm going, doing this before you read the text because it's a very challenging article. Don't be discouraged if you read this article and you think, oh my goodness, I've lost it. I don't know what she's arguing or saying. Keep going, keep reading. There are moments where it's difficult and then you might start to understand again. That's good. I don't expect you all to master this text. I understand how difficult it is, but I also think it's important to give folks a challenge at times. So Mahmoud is studying the Mahmoud is studying the women's mosque movement in Egypt. And part of what she shows is that, okay, we're going to look at Egypt in the 20th century. Over the period of the 20th century, women's rights becomes a compelling concept in a movement within Egypt. So, in the mid 90s, excuse me, mid 1900s. So in the 20th century, as women's rights becomes a compelling concept in Egypt, there are new roles for women in Egyptian life, whether that means women can now, go to the university, whether it means they can go on to become whatever particular professional position they want. It also created new roles for women in the mosque, and that's what she specifically looks at. And this is all taking place within what we call Islamicization, this upswing towards Islamic revival throughout North Africa, the Sahel region of Africa, and the Middle East. So ever since the 1970s, 80s, 90s up to now, we have had these kind of charismatic forms of Islamic belief systems that are becoming more popular. But what Mahmoud is really interested in when she looks at this women's mosque movement, that is this movement in which women now are allowed to take on certain roles within the mosque. These are roles in which women act as teachers to other women to teach them certain concepts, core concepts in the Quran. This is not giving them authority over men. These women are taking on roles that are kind of below that of many of the important imams in a particular mosque. But what's interesting, what's kind of contradictory, is that, as women's rights movements of the 20th century in Egypt eventually let women take on these new roles and positions, including, again, university students or becoming teachers in these mosques, we have the seemingly contradictory reality that with these new freedoms, these women that are teaching the mosque are teaching other women to how to enact to become a good woman, to be a pious woman. In other words, how to take on a certain conservative gender role and performance, and how to defer to men, including male religious authorities. Mahmood writes, the pious subjects of the women's mosque movement occupy an uncomfortable place in feminist scholarship. They pursue practices and ideals embedded within a tradition that has historically accorded women a subordinate position and seek to cultivate virtues that are associated with feminine passivity and submissiveness. In other words, this is not what feminists want to see, right? Feminists want to see women taking on being the university student and going on and getting a PhD and taking on some sort of, or going on and becoming a car mechanic. Whatever it is, they want to see women as pushing back against those norms that said that women couldn't do something, that said that women couldn't be truck drivers, right? But that's not what these women are doing with their newfound rights. They are becoming, some of them are, but others, like those that Mahmood is studying, are, are becoming a part of this movement that rests very uncomfortably with secular, that is non-religious or a-religious, feminist thought. Right? In other words, these are women that aren't actually wanting or seeking to be freed from men's subordination. And that's, you have to be able to understand that to kind of understand the other parts of her argument. So, Mahmood says, well, let's look at some of the older feminist scholarship on Muslim women in the Middle East. And if you read carefully, you'll actually notice that one of the scholars she's reading is the work of Janice Badi. That's, remember, the anthropologist who worked in northern Sudan that we read. So we read about, female genital cutting by Badi when she, Badi's interpretation of that practice. But Badi also spends much of her her ethnographic work looking at spirit possession amongst women in northern Sudan. But anyway, Mahmood says, okay, let's look at, early feminist scholarship and literature in the Middle East is always looking to find examples of women's agency through resistance. They're trying to find moments when women are resisting male authority or domination. And Mahmood said, is that what agency is really only about? Can we only think of agency as moments when women resist the power structure? She says, where else can we see examples of Muslim women's agency? So, of course, here I have pictures of kind of, liberal Muslim women, subjects, right, resisting this certain kind of structure. This is not the women that Mahmood's looking at, but she's looking at women in this mosque movement and saying, what, they are performing a kind of agency too. It just might not be the kind of agency that a certain secular liberal feminist subject wants to see. So Mahmood is saying that secular liberal social movements, the feminist movements, right, are how we tend to think about agency in feminism. And this is a problem, Mahmood is suggesting. Why must we find agency only in examples where women are trying to resist men's authority, or when they're trying to look for emancipation or freedom or some sort of, social justice project against subordination? So what Mahmood is suggesting is that maybe women activists who are working for conservative projects or normative political movements, they're showing us agency too. It's just not the kind of agency that feminist theorists are used to or are wanting to see. One example she gives in the text, in the US context, is when white feminists in their second wave movement are saying, let's do away with the nuclear family. It's oppressive. We don't need this. And then Native American women, African American women said, wait a second, we never were even able to have the choice to have a nuclear family. Our families were disrupted by slavery, by colonialism. right? So, in other words, sometimes arguing for something that seems normative or conservative is actual. Well, first of all, is a kind of important self-defining act, and therefore is an act of agency. The example that Mahmood gives, which I think is really helpful, which has always helped me, is that of the concert pianist, right? This idea that um, the concert pianist is showing agency. They are exerting themselves in a certain way to the very strict discipline through what she calls docility, through subordinating to these hierarchical structures of apprenticeship, of student teacher relationship. Right. In other words, to become a concert pianist, you have to be very, very disciplined, right, to these structures. You're not resisting them. The concert pianist isn't going to say, I don't need these structures, down with the system. Nope. In fact, they follow the system to a T. They learn all the very particular, uh, you know, movements, and they follow a very strict practice schedule, right? But that's still agency. That's still them, that particular individual making their mark on the world in some way. Mahmood writes, agentive capacity is entailed not only in those acts that result in progressive change, but also those that aim towards continuity, stasis, and stability. So part of what Mahmood is doing in her work is challenging the kind of assumptions that Western feminism brings to the table. One of them being that we can only see agency in secular liberalism, in notions of individualism, an idea that people are agents of free will. Again, I recognize that this material is a bit difficult, but I just want to give you this background, and I'm hoping that helps you when you start reading the text on your own. Mahmood writes, the idea of, and this is one of, I think, the key quotes of the piece, the idea of individual liberty as the political ideal. In other words, the idea that freedom, we should all be fighting for our own freedoms and rights, is relatively new in modern history, and in many societies, including Western ones, have lived with aspirations other than this. In other words, maybe there are societies, maybe there are cultures of women, maybe there are individual women who are enacting agency in ways that don't look like the kinds of agency that secular liberal feminists, most of us in this class, are used to or wanting to find. This will come up when we watch the film World Before Her, and particularly when we start talking about conservative feminist movements. Okay, thank you for watching, and I will see you all on Thursday.